A man with torn clothes and an unkempt beard walked into a high-end bakery in Madrid. He approached the counter with his eyes downcast and asked the owner if he had any cake about to expire because it was his wedding anniversary with his wife and he wanted to give her a gift. The baker laughed in the man's face and told him to leave before he called the police. But what no one knew was that sitting at a table in the corner was Carlos Mendoza, one of the richest men in Spain, owner of a chain of luxury hotels. What he witnessed in that moment would change the lives of everyone present forever. Madrid was waking up under a gray November sky. The streets in the city center were already crowded with suited people rushing to their offices, phones glued to their ears, coffee in hand. No one looked down. No one noticed the figures huddled in building doorways, wrapped in worn blankets. Antonio Garza was 64 years old, but he looked at least 10 years older. Life on the streets had carved deep lines into his face, turned his hair gray, and hunched his shoulders. But his eyes, those brown eyes that his wife Carmen had fallen in love with from the very first moment, still held a special light. A light that spoke of dignity, unbreakable love, and an inner strength that no hardship had managed to extinguish. That morning, Antonio had woken up before dawn in their makeshift shelter under the Vallecas Bridge, where he lived with Carmen. He watched her sleep, her frail body wrapped in a blanket they'd found in a dumpster months earlier. Even asleep, even with messy hair and a face marked by exhaustion, she was still the most beautiful woman in the world to him. It was November 24, their wedding anniversary. 37 years earlier, on that same day, they had gotten married in the little church in their village in Extremadura. She wore a white dress sewn by her mother. He wore a suit borrowed from his older brother. They had no money, but they had love, and that love had been enough to build a life together. That life had collapsed 6 years earlier when the construction company where Antonio had worked for 32 years went bankrupt. At 58, no one wanted to hire him. Their savings ran out quickly, then the house, then the dignity of asking for help from family who had turned their backs. Carmen got sick. The medications were too expensive, and little by little they ended up on the street. But even on the street, Antonio had never stopped loving his wife. Every day, he tried to make her life a little easier. He'd bring her flowers picked in Retiro Park, read her abandoned newspapers from park benches, tell her stories to make her smile. And somehow, every year, he managed to celebrate their anniversary. This year was different. Carmen was getting worse. The cough that had tormented her for weeks wouldn't go away. Antonio knew she needed medicine, a warm bed, nutritious food, but all he could offer was his love and his presence. He'd woken up that morning with one fixed idea. He wanted to give her something special, something to remind her of the days when they could afford small luxuries. And what could be more special than a cake for their anniversary? He'd walked for hours across the city, staring hungrily at bakery windows, not for himself, never for himself, but for Carmen. He knew he could never afford to buy anything, but maybe, he thought, some kind baker would give him something about to be thrown out. Food that was still good, but no longer sellable. That's how he ended up in front of Pasteleria Imperial, one of the most exclusive shops in the Salamanca neighborhood. The window display was a triumph of elaborate cakes, pastries decorated with fresh fruit, sweets that looked like little works of art. Antonio stopped to stare, his nose almost pressed against the glass, trying to imagine the taste of that beauty. Then he gathered his courage and went inside. The interior was even more luxurious than the window. White marble floors, crystal chandeliers, elegant tables where well-dressed customers sipped coffee and ate churros with chocolate. Antonio immediately felt out of place. His worn clothes, broken shoes, the smell of the street. He saw the disgusted looks from the customers, felt the uncomfortable silence that fell when he entered. But he thought of Carmen. He thought of how her eyes would light up seeing a cake, and he found the strength to approach the counter. Behind the counter was Javier Ruiz, the owner, a man in his mid-40s with hair slicked back with too much gel and a practiced smile he flashed at wealthy customers. That smile vanished instantly when he saw Antonio approaching. Antonio spoke softly, almost in a whisper, trying not to draw attention. He explained it was his wedding anniversary, that his wife was sick, that they had no money, but he wanted to give her a gift. He asked if by any chance they had a cake about to expire, something they were going to throw away anyway. Anything would do. Javier's response was a mocking laugh, loud and deliberate, drawing everyone's attention. He told Antonio this was a place for decent people, not a shelter for bums. He told him to get out immediately before he called the police. He said people like him shouldn't even dare step into a place like this. Antonio lowered his head, feeling tears sing his eyes, but he refused to cry. Not there, not in front of those people. He turned to leave, shoulders slumped under the weight of humiliation. But at that moment, a man stood up from a table in the farthest corner of the bakery. Carlos Mendoza was 67 years old, with a fortune estimated in the billions of euros. He owned the Mendoza Palace luxury hotel chain with properties across Europe. He also owned restaurants, wineries in La Rioja, and real estate across half of Spain. Newspapers called him one of the most powerful men in the country. But that morning, Carlos wasn't in Madrid for business. He was there for something far more personal. He'd come to the bakery for a meeting with an old friend that had been canceled at the last minute. He'd stayed anyway, sitting at his corner table, drinking an espresso, and looking out the window. He was thinking about his wife, Lucia, who had passed away 4 years earlier after a long illness, thinking about how all his money hadn't been able to save her. Thinking about how alone he felt despite his mansions, yachts, and bank accounts. Then Antonio had walked in. Carlos had watched the whole scene in silence. He'd seen the dignity with which the older man approached the counter. He'd heard every word of his request, spoken with shame, but also with obvious love for his wife. He'd seen the baker's cruel laugh, the public humiliation of a man who had done nothing wrong except to be poor, and something inside Carlos broke. He stood and crossed the bakery with determined step. His clothes, a simple cashmere sweater and elegant pants, didn't immediately scream wealth, but his posture, his bearing, the way he moved spoke of a man used to being in charge. He stopped next to Antonio, who was about to leave, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Antonio turned, eyes wet, probably expecting another insult. Instead, he met the kind gaze of a stranger. Carlos addressed the baker in a calm but icy voice, asking if that was how he treated customers. Javier, not recognizing Carlos, replied arrogantly that the man wasn't a customer, just a stinking bum bothering respectable clientele. Carlos nodded slowly, then asked how much the most expensive cake in the place cost. Javier, confused by the shift, pointed to a 3-tier cake decorated with Belgian chocolate and fresh strawberries. It was 350 euros. Carlos pulled out his wallet and placed 4 100-euro bills on the counter. He said he'd take that cake and that he was giving it to the gentleman beside him for his wedding anniversary. The bakery fell completely silent. Javier stared at the money, then Antonio, then at Carlos, trying to figure out what was happening. Antonio stared at Carlos in disbelief, mouth open, unable to find words. Carlos wasn't finished. He turned back to the baker and said he was disgusted by his behavior. He should be ashamed of treating a human being that way. True elegance, he said, wasn't in expensive cakes or crystal chandeliers. It was in how you treated people. Javier stammered, trying to justify himself, but Carlos cut him off. He introduced himself, his name, his company, his hotels, and said that from that moment on, Pasteleria Imperial would lose all contracts with his hotels, all supplies, all partnerships. Javier's face went from arrogance to terror in an instant. He started apologizing frantically, saying it was a misunderstanding, that he hadn't known who Carlos was. But Carlos stopped him with a raised hand. He said he wasn't interested in Javier's apologies. If Javier wanted to apologize, he should do it to Antonio and mean it. Antonio couldn't believe what was happening. Minutes earlier, he'd been humiliated, thrown out like a stray dog. Now he had a cake worth more than he'd seen in months standing in front of him, and a powerful man defending his honor. Javier approached Antonio with his head down. His apologies were clumsy, clearly driven by fear of losing the lucrative Mendoza contracts. But he said them, toned. He apologized for his words, for his disrespect. Antonio, with a dignity that surprised everyone, accepted with a simple nod. He didn't say anything harsh. He didn't use the moment to humiliate the man who had humiliated him. He just accepted and turned to Carlos. Carlos saw something in those eyes that hit him deeply. No anger, no resentment, just gratitude and a quiet dignity that no poverty had eroded. In that instant, Carlos knew he was in the presence of someone special. He asked Antonio to sit with him at his table. Antonio hesitated, looking at his dirty clothes and calloused hands, but Carlos insisted. And so they sat, the billionaire and the homeless man, over two hot coffees. Antonio told his story. He talked about the company going bankrupt, the jobs he couldn't find, Carmen's illness, their slide into the streets. He spoke without self-pity, without begging for sympathy, just the facts. Carlos listened in silence, and the more he heard, the more moved he felt. This man had lost everything, yet he hadn't lost his love for his wife. He hadn't lost his humanity. In 30 years of business, Carlos had met thousands of people, but rarely had anyone affected him so deeply. When Antonio talked about Carmen, her illness, the cough that wouldn't quit, Carlos made a decision. He hadn't planned it. He just knew it was right. He told Antonio he wanted to meet his wife. Antonio was shocked, almost scared. He explained they lived under a bridge, that it wasn't a place for someone like Carlos. But Carlos smiled and said he'd slept in far worse places when he was young, before he'd made his fortune. They left the bakery together, Antonio carefully carrying the huge cake, Carlos walking beside him like an old friend. The customers watched them go in silence, some curious, others ashamed for not having done anything sooner. The trip to the bridge took nearly 40 minutes. Antonio led Carlos through increasingly run-down streets, dirtier alleys, parts of the city tourists never saw. Carlos took it all in, realizing how little he knew of the real Madrid. The one of the poor, the invisible. When they reached the makeshift shelter under the Vallecas Bridge, Carlos saw Carmen. She was sitting on a worn mattress, wrapped in blankets. Pale and thin, but when she saw Antonio return, her eyes lit up with a light Carlos recognized well. The same light he'd seen in his wife Lucia's eyes when he came home from a trip. Antonio knelt beside Carmen and showed her the cake. Antonio watched her bloom again and thanked God every day for the miracle that had entered their lives. Carlos visited regularly, not to check on Antonio's work, but for the pleasure of their company. He'd sit in their little apartment, drink the coffee Carmen made with care, and talk for hours. He'd share memories of Lucia, the happy times, the emptiness she'd left. Antonio and Carmen listened, comforted him, offered the genuine friendship he couldn't find in his circles of the rich and powerful. One night, Carlos confessed something he'd never told anyone. He felt guilty about his wealth. He'd spent years building empires, chasing success, but for what? His wife was gone. His children lived abroad and rarely visited. His friends were really just business contacts. Antonio listened quietly. Then he said something Carlos would never forget. Wealth wasn't guilt. It was responsibility. Carlos had the power to change lives as he'd changed theirs, and using that power for good was the best way to honor Lucia's memory. Those words planted a seed. In the months that followed, Carlos started seeing the world differently. He visited homeless shelters, talked to people on the streets, heard their stories. He realized Antonio and Carmen weren't exceptions. There were thousands like them. Good people knocked down by bad luck who just needed a chance to get back up. He decided to do something big. He announced the creation of the Lucia Mendoza Foundation in memory of his wife. It would build housing for the homeless, offer job training and employment opportunities, provide medical care for those who couldn't afford it. Carlos poured hundreds of millions of euros of his fortune into the project and asked Antonio to help. 2 years after that morning in the bakery, Antonio stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people. He wore a new suit, first he'd owned in decades. Beside him was Carmen, beautiful in a blue dress, fully recovered and glowing. On his other side was Carlos, looking at him with pride. It was the opening of the first Lucia House, a building with 40 apartments built by the Mendoza Foundation for homeless families. Antonio had been named director of the foundation's job reintegration program. His experience, empathy, and ability to connect with people who'd lost everything made him perfect for it. Antonio took the microphone and looked out at the crowd. Journalists, politicians, business leaders, but mostly the families who would live in those apartments, looking at their new future with eyes full of hope. He told his story, the company failure, the fall to the streets, Years of cold and hunger, that morning in the bakery, the humiliation, then the miracle. He said what happened to him could happen to anyone. No one was immune to bad luck, but everyone deserved a second chance. He looked at Carlos and said a rich man had taught him that true wealth isn't measured in money, it's measured in humanity, compassion, the ability to see people beyond their circumstances. Carlos had given him more than a job and a home. He'd given him back his dignity. Carmen cried quietly, holding her husband's hand. Carlos wiped his eyes, trying to stay composed. Antonio finished by saying everyone in the crowd, rich or poor, had the power to change someone's life. It just took one act of kindness, one moment of attention, the willingness to see the invisible. He invited them all to use that power every day in every way possible. The applause was thunderous. That night, after the ceremonies, interviews, and handshakes, Antonio, Carmen, and Carlos gathered in the little hotel apartment. Whoa, see, it had become tradition. These quiet nights where three unlikely friends shared stories and laughter. Carlos said Lucia would be proud, that he finally felt he was doing something meaningful with his life, something beyond profit and personal success. Antonio smiled and said it all started with a cake, one he'd never even managed to buy. Carmen laughed and said it was the most expensive cake in history. It had bought a friendship, a new life, and now homes for hundreds of families. Carlos laughed too, then grew serious. He said something he'd been thinking for a while. Antonio had saved his life that day in the bakery, not the other way around. Carlos had been drowning in loneliness and emptiness, and Antonio had shown him a different way to live. The three sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on the incredible journey they'd shared. Then Carmen stood and went to the kitchen. She returned with a simple homemade cake. Nothing like the €350 one, but made with love to celebrate the foundation's opening. She cut 3 slices and passed them out. Antonio took Carmen's hand and kissed it. But soon, thanks to the Lucia Foundation, they too would have a home. And maybe, like Antonio, they'd find someone willing to look past torn clothes and see their humanity, because that was the biggest lesson. You didn't have to be a billionaire to make a difference. You just had to be human. You just had to stop, look, see who needed help, and act. Javier Ruiz, the arrogant baker, closed his business 6 months after that morning. Losing the Mendoza contracts was just the start. The story spread, and no one wanted to be associated with the man who'd laughed in an elderly homeless man's face. Some said it was too harsh a punishment, but Antonio, true to his generous nature, tracked Javier down and offered him a job in the foundation's soup kitchen. Javier turned it down, too proud, but the offer had been made, and that said everything about Antonio's character. Real strength wasn't in revenge, but in forgiveness. Real wealth wasn't in hoarding, but in giving. And this story, which began with an expired cake that was never even obtained, ended with a promise that love, dignity, and compassion could transform not just 2 lives, but the whole world, one gesture at a time.